Today, we have the distinct pleasure of spending some time with Dr. Edward Weinshel from San Francisco, who is our visiting professor and has been here for several days and will be here for further talks and discussions until Saturday. And this, of course, is under the auspices of the Michigan Psychoanalytic Institute and Society, but is also a situation in which he addresses groups from the fields of mental health in Lansing, Ann Arbor, the various hospitals, meets with the candidate group of the Institute, meets with the Society, and comes to us as an old friend with one of those distinguished careers which one can never do justice to in a brief introduction of this sort. However, he's here on a scientific mission, clearly, on an educational mission. But we want to not concentrate on his writings. We don't want to concentrate on his varied contributions. Not that these won't all be included, but there's an opportunity to get to know the man behind his deeds, his contributions, and his career. And later on, we'll have a chance to meet and talk with his delightful wife, who's with us here in the studios at Wayne State University. And without further ado, let me ask you, Ed, how did you get into this field of analysis?
Inadvertently. During the war, I was taking basic training in medicine, for being prepared to get into the service. And one day, there was a sign on the bulletin board. It was a very full bulletin board with announcements about all kinds of activities such as bird watching and stargazing and stamp collecting, etc. And one of the little cards said, all those who have a burning desire to learn more about psychiatry, sign your name. And so I signed, and about 3 weeks later, or something like that, about 100 of us were invited to take 2 steps forward because we were all going to the School of Military Neuropsychiatry. This was a time when the Army had a tremendous need for psychiatric help. And so they established in the New York area 3 schools for military neuropsychiatry. One was at Bellevue, one was at Columbia, and one was at a place on Long Island. And I was assigned to the school at Bellevue, which was a very fortunate event because it was there that I came in contact with a whole lot of psychoanalysts, part because they were on the faculty at Bellevue, and also it was a time when psychiatrists and psychoanalysts in New York City really went out of their way to be helpful in coming to the various conferences that were held at these various training installations. It was also there that I met Norm Ryder, who later became first the head of the training program where I finished my residency training, and I guess my first supervisor analysis and a good friend. And it was during that period that I became interested in psychoanalysis. And then when my first assignment in the Army was, again, very, very luckily, was at one of the 3 hospitals that the Army had set aside for psychiatric cases. And this one was at Darnell General Hospital in Kentucky. And again, on that staff, there were a number of people who not only had an influence, but took active part in training me. Probably the one with whom I had the greatest contact was Mike Sirota, who you remember.
Oh, yeah.
And Mike had charge of a ward. It was an amazing setup. There were about 500 patients, all of whom had made a suicide attempt. And Mike was a natural-born teacher. You know, he had both a PhD in neurophysiology, and he was, I think by that time, already a training analyst in the Chicago Institute. And he was delighted to have, as I was assigned to his ward, you know, someone who was interested and eager, and he literally set aside 2 hours every day to teach me.
Good heavens.
And so that probably was the most profound experience. But there were people like Vic Rosen and Mike Grotjan was there, and a few others. There was one from Michigan whose name I forgot now. That was a long time ago. Yeah. But although it was a hospital, you know, for a lot of disturbed patients, there was a tremendous psychoanalytic input, and there was no question that was the franca lingua, you know, of the place.
Now, you said that when you came out of medical school, which, as I recall, was right in the early 40s, your intentions then were internal medicine?
That's correct.
All right. And so the turnaround came really when you were in military service and you had these opportunities that just began to, as you say, providentially turn up in a sense, but I have the very distinct impression that these opportunities fell upon very receptive responses within you.
Frank, I wish that were entirely true. I remember there were a couple of people at Bellevue who I think I drove to distraction because I was arguing at that point. I emerged as a super scientist, and I was absolutely sure that psychoanalysis was the devil's business.
Yeah.
And it took some time. I mean, there was some fine people there. I guess the one I became most closest to was Jack Frosch, who worked there. So, you know, I got to know them, and they were tolerant, they listened, and they also taught. The only other one who turned out to be an analyst in that group was Bill Robbins, who was in Philadelphia. But it wasn't that way right from the beginning. The kind of training I'd had in psychiatry was hardly conducive to becoming, you know, to building a fire in analysis.
Highly neurologically oriented,
yeah, with
institutional.
With a lot of overt hostility, and a number of the faculty there took great glee in talking about it as psychoanalysis, but actually quite a few came from that program, ended up in psychoanalysis.
Now, how did you get to San Francisco? I mean, you mentioned.
Well, I'd had about 2 years of residency at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I was getting kind of, pardon me, unhappy with the program, partly because of its anti-analytic, and it wasn't a terribly exciting program at that time. And one day I read in one of the throwaways that Norm Ryder had become the head of the Department of Psychiatry at Mount Zion.
Whom you had met in New York.
Whom I had met in New York. And in those days it was fairly easy, in a sense, to get a residency because it was very informal. There was no matching program, not a lot of red tape. And the government was first beginning to invest in training. And it was as simple as calling Norm Ryder and asking him what chances were of my getting a residence there, and he just said, "Come on out." And that was the end of it. I mean, or the beginning, however you want to.
The beginning and the end of it, in a sense. And you've been located, of course, in the San Francisco area.
Yeah.
Now, what was analytic training like? I mean, you've been associated with analysis now for these many years, and can you give us a sense of the analytic community at that time, training at that time?
It was really a fine analytic community. Erickson was still there for part of it. Windholz was there. Anja Menken. Bernfeld, I think, was still connected with the
Institute at that time.
And actually, listening to him was one of the things that got me to actually apply for analytic training.
Is that right?
And it was really very exciting in that way. The actual analytic, I mean, the background was very exciting in the sense that these people who really, were part of an earlier era. I don't think the training, actual training, was as good as we have now in most places. It was a much smaller cadre, but it was fun.
Structured.
Pardon?
Less structured.
It was less structured. I think a lot of it had to do with, there were relatively few teachers available, and they had to use the resources they had. And some of the seminars were extremely good, some less so. But I suppose it hasn't changed very much in that respect. But I think it was easier than it was now. There wasn't as much to learn. And there was less heterogeneity within psychoanalysis, so there wasn't a good deal of that internal conflict about which side you're on or what are you going to select as part of your own core. I guess in the overall I enjoyed it a tremendous amount.
Now, you moved to San Francisco after you called Norm Ryder, and again, this was not to go into analytic training. This was to find a program in your psychiatric development that was more interesting and more vital.
Right.
You had been at Wisconsin for your undergraduate years and for medical school.
Right, right.
Had been there before you went to the military and after you returned from the military.
That's correct.
And then moved. Now, did you marry during this period of time? Did you have a family that went with you?
I was married in 1940.
All right.
And by the time I went off to the wars, I already had a daughter.
I see.
Yeah.
So this entailed then moving your family to this was a big move.
That was a big move.
Right. And you'd been doing some moving around during the military already.
We always saved our boxes.
I see. Always packing them or unpacking.
Right.
All right. Now, who were the people in the San Francisco experience? You mentioned Norm Ryder and you mentioned Bernfeld. Who were the other most important influences on your thinking, on the style as you were developing it in this formative period of your analytic life?
Well, I guess Vic Califf would have to be one of the people.
An outstanding.
And we became very, very close friends. And at a certain period, I don't remember when, we started to spend time talking together and thinking together. And then we collaborated in the course of years, about 10 or 12 papers. And so Vic, who was really a very charismatic character and intense.
And a keen analytic man.
And then somewhere along the line, I wish I could pin it down, it was probably in the late 50s, early 60s, late 50s. I met Max Skittleson for the first time, and I met him under circumstances that we were both on the working committee to set up a, not a Festschrift, but a program equivalent to that for Norm Ryder when he left as chief of the Department of Psychiatry. And I walked in that one morning, probably a minute or two late, and there was Gittleson, who was also always kind of an impressive figure. But it was like 7 o'clock in the morning, and there he was sitting with a great big black cigar, smoking happily before breakfast. And I figured any man who could do that was a man of character. And I began to read his material. I mean, I was intrigued, because he had a kind of quiet authority, and I was impressed. And after a while, I had read almost everything he had written and became even more impressed. And there's no question that he became one of my idols. And I suppose he lived far enough away, so it made it easier to retain him, keep him there, you know. It's, And then his widow came out to San Francisco, in the Bay Area at least. I don't remember the exact date, but later. And we became very, very good friends, and that crystallized and solidified my attitude about Gittleson. I guess I tend to quote him, it seems to me almost every time I write a paper these days, and where the idea of the limits of psychoanalysis, I think I borrowed that from Gittleson. So he was very influential.
Would his interest in an area that we'll come back, I hope, to discuss further, because the circumference and the interaction between psychoanalytic practice and theory and other modalities in the mental health field is, I know, of course, an important interest of yours. It must have, I never knew Max Gittleson, you know, in any way in which you have, but I do recall the ferment in the Chicago Institute with Alexander and the struggle to determine just where analysis began and left off, and so on and so forth. It was a big issue in those days. Still is, I guess. So that that continued on, I would have to say, in your own thinking and in your own interests and in your own writings.
Well, actually, I didn't know much about that at the time when I first knew him. You know, and if you think about it, most of those were secret things that didn't emerge until considerably later. And most of what I learned about those battles in Chicago, I learned later from Fran Gittleson, or what became more public. It wasn't until considerably later that I learned about those things.
Right. His writings then began to influence you in what direction?
Well, you know, I was so intrigued. So many of the people that we looked up to and we still think of as amongst our, you know, in our gallery, were focused in one or two areas, you know. And one of the things I liked so much and found so attractive about Gittleson stuff is I don't think he was ever identified with any one topic or thing. If you go through his collected papers, I mean, he's written about infancy, old age, technique, he talked about narcissism very, very early, you know. He talked about everything. He was concerned with every facet. And that was both a kind of a challenge and as a kind of a model almost of what, because, you know, it seemed to, and pardon me, and in addition, he was one of the people who was interested in psychotherapy as well as psychoanalysis. And he was also interested in political and social aspects. Also, I think coming from Mount Zion, where we were aiming at a really very, you know, real kind of interdisciplinary work in our training, as far as I know, Gittleson was the first person who publicly, and as an officer of the American, called for, as he put it, casting a wider net for our candidates. In other words, in terms of including non-MD trainees. And that, of course, hit a note.
Ooh.
So, I mean, because this was something that I thought was, and when I became chairman of the board, I guess I imitated him in a way. I gave my farewell address as chairman of the board, quoting him, and but calling for the same kind of thing. And it was at that time that Homer Curtis was appointed the chairman of that first series of committees in terms of dealing with non-MDs. So, you know, he was an admirable man. I have a hunch he made a share of enemies on the way, because I don't think he was ever known as a great compromiser. But it was fun trying to get a feeling of what he was like.
The ways in which you became better acquainted with him personally would have been through your association in the American and so forth.
Actually, it never really happened. I think I can count the times that I met him.
Is that right?
And it seriously, it sounds like a joke, and that I became interested in him because of that big black cigar. I mean, and I had been smoking cigars for a long time. But the idea
not before breakfast.
Not before breakfast. And you know, I met him once, I think, there was a meeting of the American, it might have been the 50th anniversary. No,
in Chicago?
In Chicago. It was one big anniversary. No, it was the anniversary of Freud's birth.
Oh, birth. All right. In 56.
And, yeah, and Norm Ryder introduced me to, I think Max was the president of the American at the time, or something. And I met him then, and I guess there must have been a couple of other times, but it wasn't.
It was not really then a personal matter.
No, that's why I say it was really an idle, and maybe we didn't, the fact that we didn't have real contact.
Yeah.
Was,
but that wasn't the issue. It was.
No.
Now, let me ask you something, because your contributions have taken on different forms in this field. And this is completely apart, not apart from, but I mean without overstressing that your career has been a continuous analytic work-oriented career. But then in addition to that, you began contributing through the literature, through your participation in panels, and your position on the periodicals that are so central to the science. Yeah. How did this bent, this gift come about? I mean, I'm having to presume that there were forerunners of this, at least, in your college and earlier days.
When I was in high school, I was interested in writing, and I was sports editor of the high school paper, and then became editor-in-chief. The first time I came to Detroit was at a meeting of the National Scholastic Press Association, where the editors of the, I remember staying at the Book Cadillac, you know, how impressed I was. You know.
You'd still be impressed.
Yeah.
Different.
And then when I went to, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to. I had a vague idea of that I wanted to do something in the humanities. And one of the writers who I'd been intrigued with was a fellow named Max Lerner, and that he had a knack that he was interested in economics, but also, you know, in a broader base. And he died just recently, I remember, you know. And so I had this kind of fantasy that what I would like to do is be an important, have a column in newspapers dealing with economic issues. When I got out to Madison, I got on to the Daily Cardinal, which was, it was a daily, I guess they have the comparable thing in Michigan. I don't know. And because of the fact that one of the people who had been at the same high school as myself had known me and we had worked together, and he was important on the Daily Cardinal. I got a job there very quickly. And it wasn't very long until there was a big crisis there, and the crisis had to do with Ed Newman. And he was the editor of the Daily Cardinal. And then what happened was that there was a board of governors that were made up of a number of students who quite openly fired him because he was a New York Jew. And one thing led to another, which then led to a split in the newspaper, in the staff of the Daily Cardinal, and the putting out. I was on those that split off along with Newman, and it went on for a long period of time. Eventually there was a referendum, and our side lost. Newman lost, and I went through a crisis at the time. I mean, I had all these aspirations in terms of the humanities and everything. And I was young. You know, I was probably 19 at the time, 18. And I was in a real depression. I mean, not sick, but, you know,
just
that kind
really
of thing.
disillusioning experience.
And I decided I was going to devote myself to true science, and I would never, therefore, be disillusioned again.
I'm beginning to see why you stepped forward.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, and therefore you would, when did your shift take place towards the study of medicine?
Right away.
Right within this same...
That happened in the springtime, and I came back in fall and changed my major. You know, I forgot what it was, pre-med or zoology. I think, you know, I don't think
biology or whatever.
Yeah. And from there, I, you know,
started taking the prerequisites
to be going into
for medical school.
Yeah.
Any precedent in your direction deriving out of individuals? I mean, you were kind of driven from one heartfelt circumstance from the field of literature, writing, communicative arts in that area.
Well, I guess every Jewish boy grows up in, at least in that area, you know, with some member of the family asking, why don't you want to be a doctor? And I had read Paul de Creve, you know, and which really had an impact. But I guess if there was an internal motivation, it wasn't a negative one. The bête noire of my boyhood was a cousin who did everything right, whereas I had a knack for doing everything wrong. And I can still remember unpleasantly, you know, my parents saying, why couldn't you be like Leo, you know, and stuff like that. And he was a doctor. So, I mean, he became a doctor, and there's no question I've always wanted to compete with him. So that was an influence. But, you know, as you can tell, I just kind of stumbled into a lot of things.
But apparently with a continuing kind of direction, internal direction, because one of the things that I pick up on, of course, is that this earlier interest in having a column and writing and communicating, and you were talking about monetary economics. Now you're talking about
probably the much more ethereal economics of...
Now, then you and Vic Caleb began writing together.
Right.
What was your first paper in medicine? In medicine, psychiatry, whatever.
Oh gosh. I think it might have been some psychotherapeutic aspects of schizophrenia.
All right.
Else?
So you re-entered your publishing career. You joined it back together again in the field of psychiatry.
Yeah.
All right. And that has to be one of the most noteworthy aspects of your career. Your writing, your relationship to the writing of others, your relationship to the journals. How did this come about?
Well, the first time, it was, I think, 1966, something like that. think it was 1966, I was invited to become a member of the editorial board of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic.
And that's when John Frosch was...
He was still editor
Still editor at that. And you had met him back
in the old days.
Years ago, yeah.
But we had been friends somewhere along the line. And, you know, I didn't know, and I don't know what went on in terms of, but probably, I have a hunch Norm Ryder was on the Journal at the time, and I have a hunch Vic might have been. So, you know, it always, I suppose, has helped to have a friend to give you a push.
So there were associations.
Yeah.
It was familiar.
Yeah.
And you had the earlier familiarity with publishing and that sort of thing. The quarterly?
The quarterly I didn't get involved in until 1976, 77, 78, somewhere along that time.
All right. And the International?
1977, I think.
I see.
Yeah.
And each one of these, I remember an old professor of mine once said, the reward for good work well done is more work.
Right.
And I'm having to presume that would be a part of the progression that took place in your relationship with these crucial areas of communication in our field.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think I was fortunate enough to have people who gave me a push or a shove when it was helpful. Or I suppose that, you know, the nicest way to say it is give me an opportunity.
Right.
That may not be true, but nevertheless, it's the nicest way to say it, I think. And I think once you become known, you know, you're asked more often. It's not the fairest thing, but I think it happens that way.
But I think also, as you note around the institutes and so on and so forth, you offer for those who are going to take the challenge and do the enormous amount of work that is involved. I mean, we talk about it in honor of you, that you have made this contribution, but no one can miss the fact that the amount of energy that has to be devoted in these fields is, well, who knows better than you?
But one of the things I've been lucky about is I am a good sleeper, but I don't need much sleep. I mean, as my wife will attest, I have a knack of falling asleep the minute my head hits the pillow, and I wake up 5.5 hours later ready to sing. And so I don't need much sleep, and I don't get tired that often. And that's a real asset to which can't take any credit for, except a gene or two, I suppose.
So, and therefore, that time allows you more than the average person might have for reading and writing. Were you an early reader?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you remember when you couldn't read?
Unfortunately, yes, but I'll leave that off the record.
All right. But the point is, reading has become just a continuous source.
It's been a very important part of my life.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Now, let us get in, if we can, a bit into the area of first your involvement with, I'm sure, the Institute in San Francisco, the American, but I certainly want to get into this matter of international, because I know it's meant so much to you, and you have meant so much to it. So walk me through that one a bit.
Well, you know, I started going to meetings in the International in, I think, 1963. I think that was the date of the Stockholm meeting. And went to most of them. And then when Leo Rangel became president, he asked me to be the secretary of the program committee. And from then on, I got really hooked. with the IPA because it's a fascinating experience. I mean, it's because you have a chance to work with people in different countries and different points of view, and that you're exposed to all kinds of things which, even if you don't agree with, you have to think. It's I think Americans in particular are somewhat loath to get involved with what goes on in other parts of the world psychoanalytically. I mean, certainly people in South America and Europe know a lot more about what goes on in the United States as far as analysis and vice versa. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that almost all these people who are fairly well educated, after all, know English. Whereas it isn't that many, there aren't that many Americans who can read French or German or Spanish or Italian. But it's a terribly exciting experience scientifically, but also on the personal level. Selfishly, it's marvelous to get to know people in other parts of the world. And for an American, it became there was a further opportunity getting to know them well, and getting to know them well enough. So you would visit at their homes, have dinner with them in their homes, meet their children, get to know them, and have it return. And so after a while, you develop a cadre of friends. And, that's a kind of experience or group of experiences that are very hard to, you can't buy them, And I think
it takes a long time to make them.
Yeah, and it's certainly been one of the fun experiences in my life.
Now, you're an honorary member of the British Psychoanalytic Society.
Right.
How did this come about?
Well, I was the North American editor for 10 years of the British Journal. The International Journal of Psychoanalysis, International Review of Psychoanalysis, which most people forget is not really the internationals, but belongs to the British Society. And at the end of my term of office, they asked me whether it was a commercial interchange. They gave me my choice whether I would prefer to have an engraved silver platter or a lifetime membership in the British Society, and I figured I could always buy a silver platter, but how could I be? So I accepted the latter, and that's exactly what happened.
And for an economist, that's saying something. Obviously, when you speak of your relationships, you must have these endearing experiences with the British. Just an inquiry. What languages do you have at your disposal?
I'm trying to think of English and some battered Yiddish.
All right.
I really have a tin ear when it comes to any other language. I've been taking Italian lessons for 25 years, and I can't say much more than ciao. I just.
But what you're saying is these are not the other natural languages that you have at your disposal, and so in your interrelationships, it's usually a matter of depending on their English rather than your versatility in the
or lack of.
All right, so Howard. Let me say this. As you take an overview of the areas in which you've had so much contact in Europe, particularly in South America, certainly Britain, how do you compare the scene, the analytic scene, with the American scene that you, again, because of travels and associations, have become so familiar with? What can you say in that regard?
In all over?
How do you compare the area that is so beyond the ken of most of us?
Well, I guess what goes on in England is closer to what goes on in the United States, in spite of the fact that that's the home of the Kleinian group, and that they have a society it's a tripartite society. I mean, there's the Freudian group, the Kleinian group, and then what they call the middle group. But it's amazing how much they think a lot, and obviously they talk the same language. But also I think their training is closer to ours than anything else. It's and I suppose I'm biased, but I think it's the most thorough training that there is, along with what goes on in the United States. I think from there on it becomes quite different. I think what goes on in Holland is very much the same. In most of the Nordic countries, it's pretty close to the way we think. Probably, the American system until relatively recently was more of a monolithic one than anywhere else in the world. Well, with the exception, say, there are institutes in Latin America which are probably more Kleinian in a sense than in Britain, even though the Kleinians in Britain wouldn't agree. I mean, they wouldn't argue that group is more Kleinian, but they wouldn't agree with the kind of Kleinianism that there is there. But I think it's true that the Americans are more insular in a way. There's another thing that's true between the United States and America, and that is they're older in a way, and they're more stable, and the rate of growth is less than in other places. And there may well even be throughout the world some kind of chart about the rate of growth, that's possible to draw, after which there gets to be some kind of a plateau.
Kind of a population zero kind of. I'm not. I would hate to be anywhere near certain on this because I don't think anybody has done a complete study. But what is striking, for instance, is that the areas of greatest growth today in psychoanalysis are, for instance, in Argentina and Brazil, Germany, France, Italy. I think probably those 5 countries. And probably for somewhat different reasons. In Latin America, forget and particularly, we'd have to include Chile, but, among the big countries, Brazil and Argentina have been, for years and years, been living under army rule and in a very closed system. And even though there wasn't very much open persecution of analysts, indirectly there was a lot of pressure, and in both countries there was some misuse and abuse indirectly then of the psychiatrists and psychoanalysts there. And in Brazil, unhappily, there was, and it is no state secret, it's in all the literature and stuff, some of the analysts got involved in some of the torture things. It's a very unhappy chapter. But the point was that after the army regimes were removed, there was really an explosion, not just a burst. And so there's tremendous growth in those 2 countries. Now, in a funny way, the same thing is true, of course, what happened in Germany, although it was less spectacular because, during the Hitlerian reign, the psychoanalysis wasn't officially exterminated, but, it wasn't really, it really became an extension of the Hitlerian regime. So they had to start afresh. But more recently, there's been an increase in the rate of growth. And so certainly that's one of the places where there's been a lot of growth recently. In France, there's a tremendous rate of growth, but it's hard to know for sure how much of that is involved directly, as in most of the world, in a one-to-one directness with
with intellectual matters, and it's hard to know for sure how much of the influence of psychoanalysis in France is in the university or in the hospital, but it's certainly much greater of a intellectual phenomena, and particularly among Lacan and Lacanianism, and which, of course, I suppose whatever Lacanianism there is in the United States is really pretty much within the university on an intellectual level.
Yale.
Italy is very much like France in that sense, that it's also very much an intellectual matter primarily, but also a great increase in how it's practiced. I mean, sufficient. So now that they're beginning to complain about, dealing with governmental regulations and.
What you point out, of course, is that analysis in Europe, as well as in this country, has different areas in which it grows and thrives, and it's not always in just the mental health sphere.
No.
Even though, as practicing analysts, we always think of it in terms of the therapeutic situation. It's absolutely fascinating. I wonder if perhaps at this point we can ask your wife to join us, because I'm having to presume that she is very much a part of your career as well as your travels. So can we pause for just a moment?
It's a correct assumption.
Can you give us a sense of what's it like with this man?
What is it like to be married to a psychoanalyst? People ask me.
To this particular psychoanalyst. You travel extensively?
We travel extensively, especially the last 4 years with the International. And I think the richest part of it has been, for me, which Ed just mentioned, is getting to know all the people. And they're just such a fabulous group of human beings. I have felt such warmth and genuine interest in other human beings, and I really feel they're a very special group of human beings. Not, just in all the other countries, but in this country.
Now, Ed, of course, has said that he has several languages. One of them is he understands the unconscious, which is a kind of a language of its own. Some Yiddish, well-founded in English. What are your language interests?
Well, I was born in Holland, and I'm fluent in Dutch, so I'm bilingual.
All right.
And being raised in Holland, I was made to learn other languages very early. So I do have some knowledge of French and German also, some Flemish. And, so
really, and you were born in Holland.
Yes.
Came to this country
when I was in 1942, in the middle of the Second World War.
I see. And you came by yourself or with your family? I
came with my parents and sister. We escaped from the Germans who had occupied Holland for 2 years. And if you have a few hours, I'll tell you the story, which is incredible.
I think it is a story, that needs to be told, and I would really like to see that it is done, whether I have the opportunity to participate, because, I'm sure that it is such an integral part, not only of your life, but the life of psychoanalysis in this country, which, as you exited, so did so many of the outstanding people who came to this country to the benefit of American psychoanalysis. And when you came to this country, what part of the country did you come to?
We came to New York.
To New York.
And I started school there, not speaking English at all.
I see.
Just a little bit, because we had first lived for about 8 months in Jamaica, British West Indies.
In the process of...
In the process of coming here.
I see. A little bit the way the original discoverers of this continent came about. And then, how did you get to the West Coast?
I married a man, not this man, who had lived in San Francisco.
I see. All right. How did you get from San Francisco to this man?
We were both single 8 years ago. And
that's when you were married?
And not right away, pretty soon.
Yeah.
But mutual friends of ours kept insisting we should meet each other. And we were both very resistant. But they finally succeeded.
I see. Now, analysis was not then.
No.
I mean, it wasn't as though you met through some kind
Not
of
at all.
professional. And it must thus mean that you've had a great deal to kind of accommodate to, because this, you know, to begin a marriage with again a man with a career that is so complicated and involved. How have you managed
You know,
that?
the first meeting I went to was an international meeting in Finland, and I remember distinctly, and it was right in the beginning of us being together, and I remember going out to dinner with this whole group of people I didn't know, and I was so impressed that the women were totally involved, and I thought, oh, well, all these women must be analysts. And they were so, you know, the debate was so heated, and I, of course, found out they were, like myself, interested in the arts, like a very large percentage of the women who were not in the business. And I've become involved like them very quickly.
You know, I would like to continue for just hours. We have to stop. This is a vignette, if you wish. How can we condense lives such as the two of you have led into such a short period of time? Thank you for being here.
Thank you.